overly provocative title, Sharia, the Threat to America. And so I think our speaker tonight will be timely in his addressing this particular issue. Before yielding the microphone, I want to offer special thanks tonight to those who've helped the Department of Religious Studies in co-sponsoring our event. We're very grateful to the Walker Institute of International and Area Studies and its director, Robert Cox. Bob, put your hand up in the air. Thank you so much. Also, USC's Islamic World Studies program and its director, Carolyn Nagel. Carolyn can't be here tonight. And also to the Peace and Integration Council of North America and its president, Mr. Chaudhry Siddiq. At this time, I'm going to be calling Mr. Siddiq to the stage. He will be offering his own words of welcome and will introduce this evening's speaker. Chaudhry.
Thank you.
Of course.
In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, honored guests and dear friends, Assalamu alaikum. That is Islamic greeting of peace. Welcome to this beautiful evening. On behalf of PICNA, that is Peace and Integration Council of North America, and the USC Department of Religious Studies, we are delighted to have you. I would also welcome you on behalf of the 4 other co-sponsors, as James has named. That's the Walker Institute, Islamic World Studies Program, Interfaith Partners of South Carolina, and ISRA, which is Islamic Studies and Research Association. You have before you or in your hands the PICNA magazine and a PICNA brochure. The magazine holds treasures of Islamic knowledge. Outside in the atrium, as we exit after the program, you'll be able to enjoy some display of Islamic materials. And also please feel free, don't forget to take a complimentary copy of the Quran in English. In the recent years, from Islam and peace to the spirit of tolerance in Islam to this Sharia program, our partnership with the USC has prospered. PICNA has limited resources, but our stamina is unlimited. We have a low budget, we have high aims. We are humble yet ambitious. So in the coming months, hopefully, we plan to combat Islamophobia and bigotry through creating awareness and enlightenment and using compassion. Now to this evening's program. Just as Islam is arguably the most misunderstood religion in the world, Sharia is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Islam. Added to this, the current political climate, the certain politicians' rhetoric makes things even worse. Islam and Muslims, to say the least, are going through challenging times. But I believe strongly, where there are challenges, there are opportunities, just like the one this evening. So let's make the best of it. As peaceful and peace-loving Americans, I'm certain you deserve to know the truth. You need also to be able to distinguish fact from fiction, myths from facts. And to help us understand the subject of Sharia, as James introduced briefly, who can be a better person than tonight's keynote speaker? This evening we are privileged to have among us a great speaker, an accomplished scholar, and a learned Shaykh with a pleasing personality and a charismatic style. He is the founding director of a global network of Medina Institutes. He is a graduate of Al-Azhar University, the pride of Islamic learning. He is the author of many books on the science of Tawheed, Hadith, and usul, some of which are being translated into English and published. Based in Atlanta, he is the founding director of Planet Mercy and Medina Institutes in the UK, South Africa, Canada, and the USA. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Shaykh Muhammad bin Yahya al-Ninowy.
Is it working now?
Sure.
Thank you, sir. No, that's good. All right. Well, good evening, y'all, and thank you for coming to this event this evening. I appreciate obviously the University of South Carolina's involvement and PICNA and everyone who's involved in making this happen. A couple of things, obviously, I wanted to start with. My friend and colleague here, the president, I assume, from PICNA, correct? Started saying, in the name of Allah. I just don't want anyone to freak out. There's a couple of misconceptions. First of all, Allah is not exclusively the God of Islam. Allah actually is an Arabic word for God. That is the God of Abraham. So Christian Arabs, when they want to say God, they say Allah. And so do Jewish Arabs as well, or Arab Jews. Obviously, as you all know, the lineage for Jews and Christians come under Isaac, and the lineage for Muslims come from Ishmael. Both happen to be the children of Abraham. The reason I'm saying this is because some people think Allah is something different than actually what we mean by God. The other misconception I want to talk about is jihad. And jihad does not mean an offensive holy war, at least not in the Sharia that I know. Jihad is an Arabic word that means to strive, to apply, to struggle, to improve oneself, to preserve. Jihad can be personal or can be a community of persons struggling against oppression. In essence, it means to become closer to God in lifestyle and community. This type of struggle, or jihad, is to ensure that a peaceful and equitable community continues to exist. Defensive means through violence are absolutely the last thing that jihad accepts, only in case of imminent life danger. However, offensive aggression is strictly prohibited under the very meaning of jihad, according to the Sharia that we're talking about. The Arabic word for fighting is qital, not jihad. And the Arabic word for war is harb, not jihad. Another misconception sometimes in this issue of Sharia business, 72 virgins are waiting for those who blow themselves up. There is nothing in the Quran like this. I'm sorry. It just doesn't exist. In fact, the Quran emphasizes on the prohibition of suicide and killing, in the Quran, chapter 4, verse number 29 states, "Nor kill or destroy yourselves." And the Quran in chapter 2, verse 195 says, "And do not throw yourselves in destruction." These are just two examples of many. Another thing is, no, ISIS does not represent Islam. At least to the 99.9999999% of Muslims that live today. And similarly to the 99.9999999 whatever percent of Muslims that have been living in this world for the past 1400 years. In my view, and we're not going there, that's not what we're here to talk about, but ISIS has a political ideology. The causes for wars and violence in the world is not religion, in my view. It's greed, ambition, and envy. But in order to sanitize these self-serving emotions, the best way is to cloak them in religious rhetoric. This is how we can mobilize the masses. Another misconception is that Jesus is extraneous to Islam, or in Islam. Jesus is a revered messenger of God in Islam. In fact, you would not be a Muslim if you do not believe in Jesus and revere him. And believe that his message, in essence, is equal to the message of all prophets, such as Moses and Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. The Islamic tradition believes that Jesus was never dead, nor was crucified, believes that he is the Messiah, and he will return to defeat the Antichrist. I think that's good for some misconceptions. Let's talk about a couple of things that we came here to talk about. First, obviously, talking about the Sharia and the Sharia threat. Signs of preoccupation with the threat of Islam or threat of Sharia are so common today. You find them on the internet, like my friend there mentioned earlier today. And obviously politicians are using the language today. Even highway billboards have them. It is perhaps inevitable that the terror of 9/11 excited our fear of an unknown other. However, during the last 15 or 16 years, public figures and popular culture have increasingly conflated that terror with ordinary Muslims and their way of life. Stereotyping Muslims as violent and opposed to peaceful democracy are increasingly entrenched in American public culture. New conflicts emerge almost every week today. You've got, efforts to ban the imaginary threat of Sharia law throughout state courts, Quran burning stunts, general hostility toward Muslim women who wear some kind of headscarf. Centered to this public fear is the term Sharia. Sharia literally means the way, God's way, the way God would want you to live. Or guidelines for appropriate Muslim conduct, basically. This fear obviously raises deep fears among non-Muslims in the West due to its association with violent extremism movement that has hijacked and stolen the public understanding of Islam. There is an irony in all this, in my view. The largest numbers of refugees due to violence in the world today happen to be Muslims. The largest numbers of victims of violence in the world today due to wars and violence happen to be Muslims. But the irony in all that Muslims are still viewed as a disruption to an otherwise calm and content world. Having worked with American Muslim communities throughout the past 3 decades almost across this great country, helping to strengthen their work, challenge anti-Muslim rhetoric, and increase awareness about American Muslim contributions to this great nation, one can conclude with one fact, and that is that American Muslims are a vibrant part of our national fabric and have been on this blessed soil of America even before we were a nation. But you wouldn't know that from the extremist rhetoric that passes for public debate today. Anti-Muslim hate speech comes out of the mouth of too many leaders on the national stage. We have heard them compare American Muslims who practice Sharia to Nazis, or warn that Islam itself is inherently violent. And all you have to do is just do a quick Google search of verses that are perceived cruel in the 3 Abrahamic scriptures. That's all you have to do. And then you do the comparison yourself. I'm not saying anything. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to go to any scripture and take it out of context. A text out of context is a pretext. But there has been also a comparison or accusations that Muslims, American Muslims who practice Sharia, they have a fascist doctrine bent on world domination. These claims are patently untrue and dangerous. Not only do they betray our founding ideals, but divert attention from the real threats that face us all, and they feed the global propaganda machine of violent extremism. As you all know, or many of you know, the network of anti-Muslim pundits and activists have been manufacturing hysteria about the dangers of Sharia in America. The rumor goes as Islam is a threat and American Muslims are trying to Islamicize America and replace the Constitution into a set of inhumane, draconian laws that cause all of us to lose our basic freedoms. Fantasy, but American Muslims who have been in this country way before it became a nation are not a part of a massive sleeper cell. A recent Center for American Progress report describes a systematic campaign by particular organizations and politicians to convince Americans to be afraid of the Muslims who live and work alongside them. The scapegoating builds on the fear that Sharia threatens the country's social fabric and that American Muslims wish to impose their codes that many of them don't even practice of behavior on non-Muslims. The actual content of Sharia and this discourse remains vague, but that vagueness, in my view, seems to be exactly the objective, because it does exactly what it's designed to do, hinting at brutal criminal penalties, intolerance of contemporary life, misogyny, etc. And some politicians and religious leaders are promoting this factually incorrect and highly divisive message for political capital. There is a segment of American Muslims who apply Sharia in their personal lives every single day, such in what they do and do not eat, how they pray, who they marry and how they marry, and how they set the conditions of divorce and inheritance. This is no different from many Christians and Jewish traditions. Yet studies show that hate crimes and bullying against those who are perceived as Muslims are on the rise in America. But as you all know, this kind of political hate rhetoric is not new. Targeting certain groups for political gain is not a new story in the world of politics and politicians everywhere, and America, unfortunately, is not an exception. Many of us may dismiss this kind of hate rhetoric as just fringe efforts, but many of us learn more. But as we learn more, actually, about incidents of violence across the world, we realize that rhetoric in the mainstream may motivate others to action. Creating an environment where the targeting of certain religious, political, or ethnic groups is tolerated can destroy lives and communities. The precepts of Sharia, such as charitable giving, daily prayers, fasting, pilgrimage, honoring one's parents, are remarkably similar to those in Christianity and Judaism. I'll try to go over some of these, the definitions of Sharia, basically from a jurisprudential point of view and then from a linguistic point of view, and try to compare it a little bit to the practice of other faith systems as well. And spell that Sharia is really being used as a political wedge issue, nothing more, nothing less. A recent Gallup poll, not recent, 2011, Gallup poll showed that anti-Muslim bias was correlated to whether someone personally knew an American Muslim. If they did, they were less biased. But there was another factor that correlated to anti-Muslim bias, and that was knowledge of Islam itself. Those who were the least biased were those who knew a lot about Islam and those who knew nothing about it. Turns out that little knowledge hurts. So what happened with Sharia? What is this Sharia? And is this coming to a theater near you? Is it going to take over the country? Is it going to take over the court system? First of all, Sharia is not a law. There's nothing called Sharia law. Fiqh in the Arabic language, or jurisprudence, is law. Sharia is the way God wants you to live in its general objectives, to be good, to love God, love people, do good things, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. That's the general objectives. That's what Sharia tells you. How to interpret that in your daily life, that's what fiqh, or that's the Arabic word, just like Sharia is an Arabic word. I'll come to new terminology. But that's jurisprudence. That's what jurisprudence tells you. Hence, what I'm saying is, Sharia is the template, and fiqh, or the schools of fiqh, the schools of jurisprudence, or the schools of law, try to attempt to interpret that template and make law. And that's why laws will vary. I'll talk about that in a bit. But the practice of Sharia, in this way then, for the vast majority of American Muslims, is focused on family matters, primarily marriage and divorce. For American Muslims, following what they understand as the Islamic way in marriage and divorce represents the most significant aspect of their Muslim obligation, aside from formal religious observances such as prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage. American Muslims understood their personal choices of Muslim marriage and divorce processes as separate from the formal legal system regarding them a private matter relating to religious duty, or equally common, an affirmation of cultural identity. As you all know, Muslims are not one ethnicity. They're European Muslims, they're African Muslims, they're Asian Muslims, they're Middle Eastern Muslims, etc., etc. And everyone brings and comes with their own culture. Many Muslims see the court, the civil court, as man's law, in contrast with Sharia, which is viewed as God's way. But they are equally clear that the very Sharia, which is God's way, requires them to obey the law of the land and be exemplary citizens and show good citizenship as well. The concept of Sharia is meaningful, obviously, to all Muslims of all levels of observance, because it explains how to live as good Muslims and sets standards for justice, fairness, doing good, and moral behavior. American Muslims turn to Sharia to mark life's most important passages: birth, marriage, divorce, death. When faced with critical transitions, it is commonplace for individuals to feel that they must get it right by resorting to traditional practices that they and their families believe ensure that they have met their religious and moral obligations, both outwardly and inwardly. Historically, many immigrants maintain both their ethnic and socio-cultural connections via religious and cultural traditions, and obviously take pride in that, and American Muslims are no exception. So what is this between Sharia and law? I mean, Islamic law versus Sharia again. One aspect of the present moral panic is the nature of the relationship between Sharia and Islamic law. Terms which are often conflated but have different meanings. Muslim jurists, or fuqaha, comes from fiqh again, formulated Islamic law in an attempt to practice the principles of Sharia. The scholars, the jurists, who developed fiqh or jurisprudence focused on social and family obligations, for not all of the Sharia was meant to become law. Many aspects of the Sharia relate to one's personal relationship with God, where the duty is owed to God, such as fasting, such as saying good things, such as having good intentions, such as praying. Atoning for any breach takes place between the individual and God. When Sharia creates social obligations to others, such as a father's obligation to financially maintain a family, it may be enforced by law, but again, the application of the law may differ based on the school of law, which we have plenty within the Islamic tradition. As in any other social fabric system, the development of these laws reflect the existing internal socio-political forces, including the aspiration of the most powerful actors. Two examples are always brought in this matter is Iran and Saudi Arabia, constantly cited by many as examples or exemplary models of Sharia law. Both countries are theocracies characterized by authoritarianism and entrenched interests. Numerous aspects of Islamic law as it is practiced in these two countries are incompatible with modern legal systems, especially the brutal penal sanctions and extreme restrictions on women. These have nothing to do with Sharia. These are some tribal applications or tribal habits that they apply. In addition, areas of northern Nigeria, Somalia, Afghanistan, some areas of Pakistan that are outside of the central government control have also promulgated similar laws. Media attention to these examples mean that these extreme and oppressive laws have come to represent what most non-Muslims assume to be the norm when they hear Sharia. Most Muslims regard these governments and systems as aberrations, distortions of what they understand to be Sharia, just as most Christian American would regard the fundamentalist Mormon polygamists as a marginal group who do not represent mainstream monogamous Christianity. Muslims in North America are faced with many challenges, but most of them, the difficulty being in a position to defend their faith and values in the face of widespread hysterical levels of Islamophobia and public ignorance, while simultaneously distancing themselves from the extremists and what they do, whom non-Muslims believe they represent the real face of Islam. So when we're talking about Sharia, where can I find Sharia? What is Sharia? So we said Sharia obviously is the way. Where can I find Sharia? Well, Sharia is found in the scriptures. So if you want to find Sharia to Muslims, you have to go to their scripture, which is the Quran. The Sharia for the Jews, you find their Sharia in the Old Testament. The Sharia for Christians, you find it in the Bible or the New Testament. That's how then Muslim jurists look at what Sharia means in respect with every tradition. Specific details of how to apply the Sharia is not necessarily what Sharia does, but that's what fiqh does, or interpretation of the Sharia. Doing it, is it an encouraged act? How to do it? How is it valid? When is it not valid? All these things, that depends on the schools of law. And that's similar, obviously, to divorce. Sharia is about showing devotion to God through your life. Fiqh, or jurisprudence, or law, is understanding how that devotion is applied. So the way one Muslim gets married may be different from another, while both are trying to live by the Sharia. Living by the scripture, however, is not a unique Muslim experience, or trying to live by the scriptures anyway. Christians and Jews and many others do the same thing. Sharia and Levitical law that you see in Judaism have greater historical presence than does Christian law, in my view. And if you go to Judaism today, for example, you'll see parts of Israel's law coming straight from their Sharia, which is the Old Testament, the scripture. But the reason it's not true for Christians as much is because maybe Christianity in its formative stages was not a majority religion. So you wouldn't find in these Christian scriptures a list of laws like Judaism and or Islam. Maybe because at the time of Jesus, and then obviously soon after, the early followers of Jesus did not have the political power to enforce such laws, even if they had them. However, you'll find precepts, like the Sermon on the Mount, Beatitudes, the Table of Commandments that come out of the writings of Paul that deal with how to treat slaves, or how do you do government, or his letter to the Athenians, etc., etc. Those who think that Sharia law is a threat to the United States Constitution do not understand Sharia and do not know the United States Constitution. There is nothing in the Sharia or the scripture that commands its followers to take over a government. Nothing. Sure, there are always some who attempt to take excerpts from the scriptures and turn them into constitutional law. But this isn't how you enforce religiosity anyway. The Quran states clearly there's no coercion in religion. But such attempts are not native to Muslims only. Calvin's Geneva, you all know, where Calvin wanted a theocracy with him being Theo. Well, why Sharia fear is now? Why is it all over the place, everywhere you go? Again, small network of very influential, generally right-wing, organizations and individuals working to advance the threat of Sharia. Why? 3 reasons. Political reasons, financial, and ideological. Political reasons because they think it helps them drive out the conservative vote. And if you can get enough people concerned about Muslim takeover of America, you probably can get them to go and vote. Another reason, financial reasons. Some of these groups exist for the sole reason of advancing such baseless fear, and this is how they get their money, perpetuating such an industry. Ideological reasons as well, because most people who drive this kind of agenda have a lot of disagreement with many other segments of Americans, but they're not as easy an appealing target as American Muslims. The bottom line is basically criminalizing, where this is going, the way it's going, criminalizing the very existence of American Muslim. If you're an American Muslim, you're a criminal just because you are. But the United States, again, this beautiful country is a unique nation in many ways, but one of them is the sense that we have a very religious political debate. This goes back to the times before the election of John F. Kennedy and the questions that were being fired at the time on whether a President Kennedy would be under the Pope in Rome. And President Kennedy, in September 12, 1960, said, and I quote, "But if the time should ever come, and I do not concede any conflict to be remotely possible, when my office would require me to either violate my conscience or violate the national interest, then I would resign the office. And I would hope any conscientious public servant would do likewise. But I do not intend to apologize for these views to my critics of either Catholic or Protestant faith, nor do I intend to disavow either my views or my church in order to win this election." End quote. 75% of people in this great country identify themselves as Christians. And there have been many attempts in the past to sort of take things and make them part of the constitutional law, or to infringe on the firm stand of the separation between church and state. But still, with the 75%, that was not possible. and the separation between church and state remain very strong. But it seems some people are trying to say that first of all, they're trying to speak on all of the 1% of American Muslims. American Muslims constitute about 1% of the population here. So they're trying to speak on behalf of all 1%. And they're saying that 1%, all of them, they're going to actually change the Constitution. Persistent demonization of American Muslims and their faith will have negative implications on our democracy. Because what's at stake here are the very principles motivating the founding of this great country. Things that are fundamentals of democracy, from religious freedom to justice, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. But with profiling, rolling back of rights, disenfranchising a segment of society, bullying of kids at schools who are perceived to be Muslims, etc., you can rest assured that the founding principles are compromised. The scary part here is that people who are pushing such agenda are effectively saying, we're willing to give up the essential nature of this great country and the essential nature of democracy in order to get our way on this specific religion and those who practice it. But in order to understand this whole business, in a sense, again, we need to look back in history because there is a European precipitation in this. And what that means is the separation between church and state is a European result. There was a problem, as you all know, in the old days between church and state in Europe, and especially when they were mixed. And as you all know, what's worse than political tyranny is religious tyranny. Political tyranny may kill, may steal, may rob, may do whatever they want. The religious tyranny does all that in the name of God. But what's worse than religious tyranny then is the combination of both, religious and political. So Europeans had to actually free themselves by enforcing the separation between church and state. But for Muslims, there is no church. That means there is no entity that defines what religion is for the people. Because Muslims do not believe that the political state is the Sharia, nor the only interpreter of the Sharia, even if they attempted to. But the interpretation of the Sharia is a naturally organic process identified by Muslim scholars, because the state does not define religion, again. Hence, it's a fallacy to say that Islam promotes theocracy nowadays. It's just not possible, Islamically speaking, after the Prophet Muhammad himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sharia does not mandate the merging of church and state. It is, again, we say these things because, again, or people have this fear, is because people see these things from a European lens. They see the issues of law and religion through a European lens, meaning that anytime you want a religious law recognized by the state, it must be administered by the state. But for Muslim majority countries in the pre-colonization era, the classical Muslim experience is a separation between rulers who practiced politics, good or bad, and scholars who in a pluralistic way interpreted or attempted to interpret Sharia by producing law, which is fiqh, which was eventually passed by the state as a ceremonial process. Nowadays, when I look at governments having a brutal law somewhere and calling it Sharia or Islam, it is the power of government coupled with a particular view or interpretation of Sharia, that is. But I might be interested in a different interpretation of Sharia or a whole new one altogether, as it's called ijtihad in the science of jurisprudence. When we talk about particulars, we're talking about fiqh or jurisprudence. That's a human product. We're not talking about Sharia. Sharia is talking about the way of life, of devotion to God. If the interpretation of Sharia seems to be oppressing women, people, using violence to promote political agendas, etc., then this is definitely the wrong interpretation of Sharia. And even then, this one interpretation of Sharia should not be conflated to mean to take over all other interpretations and sideline them, and sometimes takes over Sharia itself. It's like when you don't like an opinion of a judge on the Supreme Court and you say, I'm going to reject the Constitution. In conclusion, let me say that within the Abrahamic faith systems, the Abrahamic traditions, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, our mandate is from God. And it is centered on freedom. God himself afforded all human beings, besides dignity, the freedom of choice. It is freedom for cooperation and doing good. In our Abrahamic traditions, freedom is respective of each of the tradition and respective of someone who does not value any of the tradition. All people deserve hope, growth, and opportunity because they're human beings. In our Abrahamic traditions, we call for a society in which religion is not the criterion by which it's decided whether you get rights and freedom or you don't. Sharia, let me finish by saying, Sharia calls all men and women, regardless of faith, Islamic Sharia that is now, calls on all women, men and women, regardless of faith. Number one, to restore the unconditional compassion to the center of morality and religion. That means if you're not good to those who are good to you, then what good are you? That means you treat others the way you would like to be treated. These are golden principles within the Sharia. The Sharia also calls all men and women of all faith to return to the ancient principle that any interpretation of the scriptures that breeds violence, hatred, or disdain is illegitimate. To ensure that the young people today, youth, are given accurate and respectful information about other traditions, religions, and cultures. To encourage a positive appreciation of cultural and religious diversity. If God wanted us all to be the same, he could have done that. But he made us different for a reason, and that's to know each other, not to hate each other. And finally, Sharia calls upon us all to cultivate an informed empathy with the suffering of all human beings, even those regarded as enemies. That's it. Thank you so much, and God bless all.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you indeed. At this time, I would like to introduce and bring to the podium our respondent this evening. But let me say, first of all, the response will be maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we have taken into consideration the fact that some of you will want to say your sunset prayers, and a room adjacent to this hall has been made available for that. So those who wish to do that, I guess who interpret fiqh in that particular way, will have an opportunity at the end of the response. Dr. Walid Al-Ansari is University Chair in Islamic Studies at Xavier University. He teaches courses on comparative religion, Islamic studies, and religion and science. A member of the board of the Peace and Integration Council of North America, an active participant in interfaith dialogue, Dr. Al-Ansari's many publications include Muslim and Christian Understanding, Theory and Application of a Common Word. We're very, very happy to welcome Walid back to USC. He was a highly valued member of our department for a number of years before Xavier University stole him away. It happens that a very good friend of mine and classmate, undergraduate classmate, is the president of Xavier University, and I'll never forgive him for taking him away from us. In any case, thank you for coming, and please listen to Walid's response.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Cutzinger. It's such a pleasure to be back. I feel this is very much of a homecoming for me. Well, anyway, I won't make any jokes about coming back to USC. When I was speaking with Shaykh Ninowy about how it is that I should respond, he told me that, I can't cover all of the Sharia in 30 minutes. So you just fill in the gaps.
And meant it in a nice way.
Yeah. No. So I'd like to actually elaborate on a few of the themes. I also heard Shaykh Ninowy say y'all 2 times. You have become acclimated to the sound. So mashallah, very good. The 2 points that I'd like to, in a sense, elaborate upon in Shaykh Ninowy's talk is that it's very difficult for our fellow Americans from a Christian background to understand the philosophy of the Sharia, philosophy of divine law. Because Christ came to bring the way, not the law. And so the principles, the moral principles in Christianity inform the law, but they don't determine it. And that's a very different conception of law that you have, for example, in Judaism, in Hinduism, and in Islam. Sharia, as Shaykh Ninowy pointed out, simply means divine law. It's the wide road to God. And so in these various traditions, it's not only the principles, the moral principles that are immutable, but sometimes the specific details. So, for example, Christ says, be kind to your neighbor. But how is it that we are to be kind to our neighbor? Christ has the principle established, but how it is that we work that out in a Christian context is oftentimes a matter of convenience, custom, convention, and so forth. Whereas in the Islamic context, there are specific rules that are laid out either in the Quran or by the Prophet of Islam, dictating what does it mean to be kind to the neighbor. So if you're living, for example, upstream from your neighbor, being kind to the neighbor means you don't pollute in the river so that your neighbor downstream would suffer from that pollution. Or you don't make so much noise and interrupt in the middle of the night, for example, your neighbor, and so forth and so on. So there are very specific rules. And even when it comes to things like taxation, in Christianity, and I hear with the adhan there, I thought we had a couple of more minutes before the sunset, but this is a difference in fiqh. I'm sure. Oh, I'm glad we got it. Oh man, that's great. Now, if you can get children to laugh, then you're doing something right. Alhamdulillah. Yes, yes. No, that's divine intervention. Oh, I like that too. So, for example, when it comes to taxation, in the Western context, when Christianity was growing, of course, because Christianity, Christ brings the way, not the law, it adopted much of the structure, legal structure of the Roman Empire, and that's why Latin is still important when we study Western law. And as Christianity spread into Northern Europe, what was adopted, of course, was Germanic law and common law and so forth and so on. And so the way that you would tax the well, for example, in Ireland, would be the same way that it was taxed for centuries. It was just a matter of custom. Or the way that you would have the road taxes in Italy would be also based on tradition and custom and so forth, but there wasn't anything in the bosom of Christianity that dictated that. Even the bishoprics or the episcopates and so forth, even the structure of the church was brought over from the Roman heritage. There's nothing that Christ said about that, and there's nothing about that in the Bible. And so in the Islamic context, however, there are certain types of taxes that are specified by Islamic law. So for example, when Christ says you should be charitable, the church over time established that as 10% of your income, the tithing. But that was for, say, 13th century Italy, and that may change now. The Prophet of Islam established zakat, which would be the minimum amount of charity, which would be 2.5% of savings that one has held for a year. It's a lot less than our income taxes, I tell you. I prefer to go with the zakat. But that sets the minimum floor. And if one is in poverty and one does not have income, or savings rather, for over a year period, then one does not pay the zakat. But that would establish, that's an example of taxation that establishes the floor. It's not the ceiling, because of course one is encouraged to give more, but that's called sadaqah, charity. That is not the minimum required tax that is part of Islamic law. And so Islamic law comes from the bosom of the revelation, and there are elements of Islamic law that are fixed, and then there are other elements that are flexible. And the analogy that scholars make is to a tree, a living tree. So as Shaykh Ninowy pointed out with regard to ijtihad, to make all things considered ethical judgments in terms of new situations that the Muslim community confronts, that is something that is flexible. So it is not that the Sharia is a dead tree that is ossified and fixed. That's not the case at all. It's a living tree, the trunk of which is fixed, and certainly the moral principles, as in Christianity, are fixed. To love God and love the neighbor, the two supreme commandments that are the source of all law and ultimately all the objectives. But that some of the elements are fixed and some of them are flexible. And so in the same way that you have a living tree that grows, and in a good year of rain you'll have large leaves, and in a bad year it'll be smaller leaves, and you have branches growing in this direction and that direction. The Sharia, or the fiqh, to be more precise, is growing. But that structure in its growth is related to the structure of the tree, is related to the roots and to the trunk of the tree. And so the philosophy of law, what is the philosophy of the Sharia? It's not just about divine rigor. It's not just about God in his absolute majesty giving us the laws. Yes, that's part of it. But the other part is it's a divine mercy. Because oftentimes the divine law protects us from dangers and pitfalls that we don't even know exist. And so much of the pain that we see among the youth is precisely because it's not that there's just one or two pitfalls out there. There are 200 pitfalls out there. And it's very easy to fall down the shaft. And so true freedom comes from freedom to be the person that we want to be. It's to be free from our egos, not to be enslaved by our egos. The worst kind of imprisonment is not the freedom to act in any way that we would like. Oh my goodness, I hear her plotting. Sorry, I didn't mean to draw attention to that. It's not the freedom to act as slaves to our passions. That's not real freedom. That's imprisonment to our egos, which is the worst kind of imprisonment there can be. But it is freedom, in a sense, to be in God.
Come up in everyday conversations. What would you suggest as ways to respond?
I'll just say a couple of things. I mean, look, what made this country great is people looking for religious freedom. The pilgrims. This country is so unique. I still say that this is the best country to be Muslim. What this American spirit that you find, and I've lived in Europe before, and obviously I lived in the Middle East as well. People here have, because of our tradition, because of how this country was formed, etc., etc., there's really lots of decent people and people who are willing to look and see and hear, and they want to be just, they want to be fair, they want to be good with other people. You see that in and out. We've seen that with Katrina, like when hurricanes come. We see these things over and over again. I think what we need to do is we need not to let into this fear. We're all strong together. There's, like I said, Muslims have been here before this country became a nation. And even though they may not have been 1% of the population, maybe a lot less, there's no attempts to change the Constitution. I think what makes this country great again is that we have that separation between church and state, and we can all be Americans. We can all do good. And I think we can take a religious principle. If your neighbor is good, that's an Islamic Sharia principle. I'm sure it's Jewish and Christian as well. If your neighbor is good, then you're good. We all suffer when things go down. When education goes down, we all suffer. When crime goes up, we all suffer. When violence goes up, not only that non-Muslims are terrified, trust me, when a terrorist action happens or a terrorist event happens, we are actually petrified, not just terrified. I mean, some non-Muslims may be terrified. They're saying, all right, this guy is walking in the airport and he looks Muslim. Uh-oh, right? What's going to happen? But I mean, you know, when your 10-year-old child comes home crying and telling you they're saying all these, other kids are saying all these things to me because of my name or because of what they think I am. And when you know, a 7-year-old child comes to you, you know, a girl tells you, you know, they're calling me sister of Osama. I mean, these are lasting scars that the rest of the American community does not see. But we live, as a religious leader, I live that every single day with my community coming back to me. Families crying, you know, kids. There's real psychological trauma, and we're stuck between, like I mentioned. I mean, on one hand, these crazy people, these violent extremists who act like this, there's not even a statistical number that you can say they represent because it's too negligible to be represented as a number anyway. But they're made to be seen as the face of Islam. And the rest of us are silent. Many people come and say, well, when have you spoken about violence? The very first thing I say, when was the last time you've been to a mosque? I mean, you know, but the microphone is selective. I'm not blaming the media. I don't believe in the blame game. You know, we need to step up, but the American Muslim community is just 1%, and we can't, you know, it's not about the 1% really. It's about the 99%. Because if we're good, then everybody else is good. But this enfranchisement doesn't help. I don't know what to do. I mean, I smile, I love everybody. I try to do good, I try to help. I believe in this country. I don't know what else to do.
I'd just like to add that the Harper Study Quran. Have you heard of the Harper Study Bible? It's a resource that many Christians use to study the Bible, and they now have a Harper Study Quran that has been edited by Shaykh Nasr, and it addresses many of these issues. They have a set of essays at the end that deal with all of these types of questions. And so, for example, every verse of the Quran in this book has a summary from 40 tafsir or 40 different commentaries. So anytime one of your friends, for example, may be misunderstanding Islam and they quote a particular verse, you can look to the study Quran and see what the scholars say about that verse and then go back to, no, it doesn't really mean that. Here's what it means. And they can look at that themselves. So this is the Harper Study Quran. It was just released a few months ago. And I think this is going to be hugely important for both American Muslims and American non-Muslims. I brought this book just for you.
I would like to be educated a little bit because I don't understand the culture, the Muslim culture. And is there a reason why more Muslims do not speak out against the radicals, either in this country or worldwide? seems like, and even in Colombia, I'm not aware of whoever the leadership is in the Muslim community that should be saying what you've been saying. And is there a cultural reason for that, or is there, what?
Yeah, can I
Please.
address that? Yeah, you know, really as Muslim scholars, Muslim American scholars, we are jumping up and down trying to get the message out to our fellow Americans, whether we sign public, documents and, and so forth, expressing this position. But unfortunately, and I will get into the blame game a little bit. Unfortunately, the press doesn't cover us. They cover, 2/3 of the press is covering the lunatic fringe. And so our fellow Americans understandably, they know where to position Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh is part of the lunatic fringe in Christianity. Our fellow Americans understand what is the mainstream and what is the periphery. But our fellow Americans do not understand what is the mainstream and what is the periphery when it comes to Islam. And it's not their fault. I mean, when you see 2/3 of the media coverage being on the lunatic fringe, it's easy to fall into this perception, well, maybe that is the mainstream. And so as the Al-Azhar University that Shaykh Ninowy mentioned, which is the oldest, it's even older than Oxford and Cambridge. It's, has 1,000+ year history. The scholars at Al-Azhar have been condemning this lunatic fringe left, right, and center. There are Prince Ghazi of Jordan, who was the chief architect of the Common Word Initiative, which is a public statement saying, what is it that we all share with our Christian brothers and sisters? Love of God and love of neighbor. And they got all of the major scholars from every school of Islamic thought to sign on to that, and publicly, I'm the 400th signatory or whatever, and that's what the whole book that we had worked with as part of Rudy Barnes, who's also here in the audience, had been instrumental in helping us get that book published, and of course Professor Carl Evans here with his Interfaith Network here in South Carolina. I mean, we've been trying, but it's almost like warped wood. I feel like every time we try to bend it to straighten it out, as soon as you let it go, it just goes back into that warped shape again. And so we just really have a huge, that's why I hope the study Quran and other things will help change that. But I understand what you're saying, but we are out. And I don't know if Shaykh Ninowy has anything to add to that. I know that you must have been involved in 100 interfaith dialogue sessions.
Look, violence is the language of the inarticulate. This is something that Islam puts as a first thing. I have a book that to substantiate. Non-violence is a fundamental Islamic principle that after unconditional compassion, Islam talked about non-violence. In fact, bent backwards just to make sure that there's no violence and bloodshed. But like I said, unfortunately, look, there's 350 million people in this country, and there's about 2,500 mosques and Islamic centers. And like my colleague Dr. Waleed mentioned, is the cameras go to the lunatics and the wackos. We're doing what we can.
Well, I hope you get heard more.
Yeah.
Continue to speak out.
Will do.
Yeah, we'll keep trying.
Well, people believe in, in the substance of what you're talking about. So, don't have a lot of knowledge of religion, but I'm aware of the fundamental principles. And I think the reaction that even during this election was in some ways a very positive reaction. It was the fringe that overreacted, but still, I think there needs to be more speaking out against the fringe element.
At least they're not indifferent to us.
Something good will come out. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you both for the context in which you provided. I felt like I learned a lot from that. And I wanted to ask if you're familiar with the book The Infidel by Iran. I'm afraid to pronounce her last name. But she doesn't characterize it the way you do. She suggests that what you're identifying as the extremists is more common, particularly in the part of the world that she comes from. So would you disagree with her interpretation, if you're familiar with it?
Well,
Could you give some context to that?
yes,
first,
yes,
maybe?
yes. This is a woman who really was traumatized with her experiences. And there is such a practice, well, called female genital mutilation. And this was a pre-Islamic practice that had to do with the customs at the time in certain parts of the Islamic world. There are certain, the Islamic world is very wide. There's the Arab cultural zone, there's the Sub-Saharan cultural zone, there's the Indian and Persian and Turkic and Malaysian and Chinese and now American with y'all. And so there are different cultural zones, and sometimes those pre-Islamic cultural practices were brought into and conflated with the principles of the religion itself. And so unfortunately, this woman, suffered as a result of that, and it's very tragic. But that is something that's unique to that particular cultural zone. It is pre-Islamic. It has nothing to do with the Islamic religion as such. And the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, Shaykh Ali Gumar, issued a fatwa saying that it is prohibited to do this. He actually issued a legal ruling stating that it is prohibited. And he is the official, you might say legal scholar that the government turns to, the second highest ranking religious authority in Islam. So you have this trauma that occurred to this lady. She became an atheist. And therefore, she's kind of adopted this form of aggressive atheism that is going very much against her own religious tradition. To what extent is that really different from Sigmund Freud, for example, who just couldn't leave religion alone? Once he became atheist, he just went all out against Judaism and religion as such. So you have in the modern world these aggressive forms of atheism that are coming from a variety of channels, whether it's Dawkins or Hitchens or whoever, that we as believers face as a common intellectual challenge. Because her message, yes, it is going after Islam, but really it's part of a broader narrative to go after religion as such. And so we have to respond to this in an intellectually responsible way. And I happen to know Tariq Ramadan, and he's a very prolific, incredible speaker, and a very prolific writer. And he had a debate with her one time, and he's a very handsome man. And she, after the debate, said, I wouldn't mind marrying a guy like that. And so I think that if she had grown up in a truly Islamic, under different conditions, things would have turned out differently.
And to add to Dr. Walid, two things. Number one, that genital mutilation does not exist in the Sharia. There's no Quranic verse that says that at all whatsoever. So it's definitely not textual. And number two, it's not only practiced by sub-Saharans or some African countries that happen to be majority Muslims, but also some African countries that happen to be not Muslims as well, unfortunately. So it's not really a religious thing. It's actually a cultural or tribal thing that sort of was allowed to fester and exists until today. And it's unfortunate.